Final Fantasy III. If not for Final Fantasy V, it might be one of the most unique and interesting Final Fantasies ever conceived. And at the time, it probably seemed just insane. Unfortunately, those of us in the West didn't get a chance to experience it until the late 2000s when a remake came out for the DS. And by then, it was very dated, unfortunately. However, the game is still very interesting to look back on. It tried very hard to give us four fully fleshed out characters with different backgrounds. You had Luneth, the leader, and Raphia, who was one of the female characters, one of the first, I might add, in Final Fantasy, before, of course, the sister character in Final Fantasy II. And each of them had different traits. For example, Raphia was more sympathetic to others. We had someone who was uncertain of himself, but who was very sympathetic to a prince because they were both very uncertain of their abilities. But they had jobs to do. It was an attempt at genuine characterization, genuine characters. Unfortunately, it just wasn't enough. The characters didn't have enough to them to make them really all that memorable. That being said, the battle system is what shines in this game. I've kind of picked on Final Fantasy 1 and Final Fantasy 2. Final Fantasy 1 for its very stiff, slow battle system, and Final Fantasy 2 for its frustrating attempts at making you stronger through grinding. Final Fantasy 3, though, does something beautiful and brilliant. It says, alright, remember that class system from Final Fantasy 1? Let's one up that. You are able to change classes in this game. You can change them almost any time you want. And the game encourages you to do this because some bosses will be easier with some classes. Now, most of us are like, well, of course, that's every game can do that now. We mix and match classes. No, this was something new at the time. You couldn't mix and match skills. You couldn't make a paladin who could cast black magic. It wasn't done yet. But for the time, the ability to pick a standard trope like a knight or a wizard and then turn it on its head and change, that was brilliant. It gave you a chance to experiment with how you wanted to play. And though there were some times when you had to play the game's way, like when you have to have mostly black mages who will turn you small so you can get through a hole, most of the time the game didn't shoehorn ideas like that in. You either needed a balanced party or you needed an unbalanced party to take down one specific boss. And it was really cool and interesting. Regrettably, the story is kind of lackluster. They try and one-up both Final Fantasy 1 and 2 by having a main villain, an evil wizard. And you see his interactions in the kingdom, you meet the people in the kingdoms. It's very much more fleshed out, but the wizard himself is entirely unmemorable. What people remember about this game is Cloud of Darkness, the final boss, who is basically an amalgam of all evil in the world, the wizard included, and is taking the form of a hot lady. She got much more attention in Final Fantasy Dissidia, and I think that that's fine. It's okay to supplement the characters later on, but looking back, the story was pretty weak. And it could be quite difficult at times. I mean, not quite Final Fantasy II difficult with all the grinding, but because of all of the different possibilities with the job classes, I mean, you could be monk, you could be summoner, you could be dragoon, you could be knights, you could be mages of three or four different varieties. There was so much you could do, but it also meant that there was so much you had to keep in mind when fighting enemies. Is the enemy going to be so strong that mages are useless because they'll just be one-shotted? It was a lot to take in for RPG players at the time. It's probably one of the big reasons we never got Final Fantasy 2 or 3 in the States until much later. It seemed like Square was convinced that we couldn't take these kind of RPGs. They were just above our heads. But that's neither here nor there. The music is once again excellent. Nobuo Uematsu's score, regrettably, is a bit more forgettable this time because there's less firsts, but the battle music is amazing. The final boss track is highly memorable, and overall the music is good. Sometimes that's all you really need in an RPG is for music to be good, for you to be able to hum it, for you to be able to remember it a little bit. And then once the game's done, you forget about it. Not every music has to change your life. It's okay. Now, thinking about Final Fantasy III, if games hadn't built on its formula, it probably would have seemed like one of the most unique games ever created because it offered so many different options. But this is the Famicom we're talking about, and eventually the DS. So, yeah, games came out that were just as good or better than it pretty quickly because they saw how interesting the formula was, and they copied it wholesale. We'll get to that when we talk about the next era, the Golden Years. This one's going to end a little short because Final Fantasy III is a very good game. There's not much to complain about it, but there's also not too much to praise about it besides the battle system. They tried with the characters and the narrative, but the battle system is what's very unique. And though still fun, it's been outshone by other games both in the series and in other series. So we'll stop here. Before we head on to the Golden Years, though, I'm going to talk about the unofficial Final Fantasies. Stay tuned.